Hello and good evening to our next online talk series, MaxCine Science Goes Public. We are happy to have you with us again. Today I step in for Babette Eid, and I'm happy to be here with you. This is the last talk before our summer break, and today we have Jenna Kohles here with us. When, Jenna, did you decide to become a biologist? How did it happen?
Yeah, so when I was growing up, I was always outside. I loved animals, but I really thought that the only ways to work with animals as a job was as either a zookeeper or as a veterinarian, and I wasn't really interested in those things. So it wasn't until high school when I realized that there is such thing as a biologist and that people could just study animals and learn more about them as a job. And so that's when I started pursuing a career of being a biologist.
And what was your favorite animal by then? Or is there a favorite animal right now you have?
Oh gosh, it's too hard to choose. I mean, the easy answer, of course, is bats because, yeah, I love working with them. They're so fascinating and they're always surprising us. And we just, in general, still know so little about them. So the world is wide open for new questions to be asked.
That's cool. That's cool. So your talk will be about how bats and even you can use social information to make better choices.
Exactly.
I would say we're getting started. The stage is yours, and everyone out there have fun with Jenna Kohles.
Cool. Thanks, Monica. So yeah, I'm Jenna, and today I'm going to be telling you about how bats, and probably even you already, use social information to make better choices. So I'm a PhD student here at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, and I'm in my third year. And first, yeah, let me just tell you a bit about myself and how I got to this incredible institute. So I was born in the States on the East Coast, and I also did my bachelor's on the East Coast studying wildlife biology. And already in my bachelor's, I became really interested in animal behavior and especially fascinated by social behavior. So why animals choose to do things together. And I got to spend one summer of my bachelor's in the tropics of Peru doing fieldwork with wildlife, and another in the States catching and monitoring endangered bats. And I just fell in love with all of these things, doing fieldwork and working with bats up close, animals that I didn't really know so much about growing up, and just simply being in nature for work. And so then in the last summer of my bachelor's, I found an opportunity that really combined all these interests. And I traveled down to Panama to the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute to work with some members of actually this institute, Dina Dechman and Tiago Mera. And that was already back in 2014. And so, not surprisingly, this was the perfect combination of all my interests, especially because bats in the tropics are so much more diverse than in North America or Europe. So it was just like a whole new world. And I knew that I wanted to continue doing research in graduate school, and Dina Dechman's lab here at the Max Planck just felt like the perfect fit. So I moved myself to Germany, and I started a master's, and then this transitioned into a PhD. And so now I basically migrate between these two places, doing field work with bats, collecting data in Panama, and then bringing that data back here to Germany to analyze it and write about it, and also just to interact with all the amazing colleagues here. It's a really amazing environment. So one title I would give myself is a field biologist, which means that I collect data from animals in the wild, in their natural habitat. And of course, this can be very challenging. There's kind of like this constant problem solving needed, but it's super rewarding. And so today I'm going to be telling you about the ideas that I've been developing for my PhD. First, how they may be relevant to you, and then also sharing some of the data that I've collected in the field in Panama with bats to test some of these ideas. So let's start with how these ideas might be relevant to you. So in my talk title, I've told you we're going to be talking about social information, and that you probably already use it. But many of you may be wondering, what even is social information? So to explain, I'm going to actually just give you some examples. So I want you to imagine that you're visiting a new town and you don't have many ideas about what's there, what there is to do, and maybe most importantly, where the best food is. So how do you choose where to eat? So maybe you're the kind of person that likes to plan ahead. So before you leave home, now we have this amazing thing called the internet, and you can just check reviews online, right, to see which restaurant people like best. And this, gathering information from others and what they say about their experiences, this is a form of using social information. But there are other ways that you could use social information. Maybe you're more of a spontaneous person, and you like to not only try new restaurants, but even more so those daily specials that restaurants like to offer. Well, reviews about daily specials like happening that day wouldn't actually be available online before you leave home, right? So how can you use social information to make a better choice in this situation? Well, once you arrive in that town and it becomes lunchtime, you could just simply walk around the part of town where all the outdoor cafes are and base your choice on what a majority of other people are doing. So if a restaurant, has lots of full tables, that's probably a pretty good indication that the food is pretty good, especially to a cafe where maybe there are mostly empty tables. And I myself have done this so many times here in Germany, actually. And this right here is also a way that we use social information, simply by choosing what to do based on what others are doing. But there's, an important difference between the types of social information people are using in these two different scenarios. So the people that are planning ahead, that look up the reviews about restaurants before they go to the new town, they're using social information in the form of signals. And signals are information that are intentionally shared. The people that are posting them are purposely telling others about their experiences. Whereas the spontaneous person, that's just simply observing what other people are doing, they're using social information in the form of cues, which means that the people giving the information aren't actually intending to share information. It's just a byproduct of what they're already doing for themselves. So now that you have an idea of what social information is, and maybe you're already beginning to think about some of the subtle ways that you use social information to make choices in your daily life, I'm going to tell you about how bats do some pretty similar things. But first, I want to ask this important question. Why? Why do we or should we care about how animals like bats use social information? So maybe you can already imagine how, although social information use can be quite subtle for us, in some situations, it could actually be pretty crucial for making the best choice, like beyond just choosing a good restaurant. And studying these kinds of behaviors in bats and other animals may help us understand this behavior in ourselves. And a second reason, and actually one that's closer to my heart, relates to conservation. So just like protecting a bat's habitat and food are important for its conservation, protecting and ensuring that it has access to other bats and the social information they provide may also be crucial for their conservation. And this has implications for how we monitor and manage bat populations. And the cool thing is, conserving bats benefits not just them, but also people, also us, because bats provide humans with so many ecosystem services. And all these ecosystem services actually relate to the things that they eat. So bats eat a huge variety of foods. Some bats eat insects, and this helps keep insect populations under control, especially agricultural pests. And then some bats eat nectar, which can pollinate plants just like bees. And then some bats eat fruit, and then disperse the seeds, which can even restore forests. And some bats even eat other things like other vertebrates like frogs or fish. And one of the reasons that bats eat such diverse things is simply because there are so many different bat species. There are over 1,400 different bat species. And this actually makes up 1/5 of all mammal species on the planet. So all these pictures you see here, these show bats doing things alone. But in reality, the majority of bat species are social to some extent, especially when roosting during the day. whether it's sharing a roost with like thousands, tens of thousands of other individuals, or just a few others. So if you put these things together, the diversity of foods that they eat, and then having lots of opportunities for being social, you can probably already guess that bats also seem to have many different ways of using social information to find food, some of which aren't that different from us. And now I'm going to tell you about some of those ways. So, how do bats use social information to find food? This first strategy, it's called recruitment, and it's similar to the strategy of the planning type of person who looks up reviews about restaurants and gets information before they leave home. Because recruitment for bats also involves signals, that information that is intentionally shared, and it's shared by bats at their home, at the roost. So here we have a bat that's roosting in the left-hand corner, and its roostmate is signaling to it with an acoustic call in orange, and the listening bat knows that this call means his roostmate has found food, in this case, ripe fruit, like we see in the thought bubble. And the listening bat is then guided to the available food by its calling roostmate. And this next strategy, called following, also involves getting information before leaving home, but it involves cues, the type of information that's not intentionally shared. So here in upper left, we have two bats in their roost, and the one on the outside is sniffing these green olfactory cues being exhaled by its roostmate. And these olfactory cues are the scent of ripe fruit, which tells this bat that its roostmate has found and eaten food, like you can see again in this thought bubble. So even though the bat exhaling those scent cues isn't intentionally sharing information with its roostmate, the roostmate can then use this information to decide to follow this knowledgeable individual, this knowledgeable bat, to the ripe fruit tree the next time that they both go out to forage, to find food. So again, the difference between these two strategies is that recruitment involves intentional information sharing, whereas following only involves unintentional information transfer. So we say that recruitment is a cooperative strategy because intentionally sharing information with another individual should be reciprocal. It only makes sense for me to share with you if you share information with me in the future, and vice versa. Whereas following is simply an opportunistic strategy, where bats use social information when it's available to them and they need it, but they likely gather their own information about their environment just as much, searching for food, often on their own. And here, I just want to give a quick shout out to the creator of all these exquisite illustrations you're going to see in my presentation today, Javi Lázaro, who was a PhD student and postdoc at our institute a few years ago. And we are super thankful for his contribution to this project. All right, so we have two more strategies. So we have local enhancement, and this strategy might remind you of the spontaneous person who leaves home and simply goes out looking for where others are eating. But bats forage at night, so they usually can't look for the visual cues of others eating. They use a different sense. Bats kind of have this sixth sense, echolocation, which is where they use sound to perceive their world. So we're going to take a quick detour now into echolocation. So the way that echolocation works is that bats produce acoustic calls, like these rings you see in green. And these calls reflect off of objects in their environment, like this moth. And the echoes come back to the bat's ears, telling it that there's an object there, but also what that object is. Their echolocation is really sensitive. And a cool thing about echolocation in the context of social information use is that bats produce different echolocation call types depending on whether they have already found food or not. So in this figure on the right, this is something we call a spectrogram, and it's a way to visualize sound with time here on the X horizontal axis and frequency here on the Y vertical axis. And here you can probably see yourself the difference between these search phase calls and these calls that bats produce when they're searching their environment versus these buzz phase calls that bats produce when they detect food like an insect and are trying to hone in on it, on its location to catch it. And bats eavesdrop on the echolocation of other bats and listen for this switch from one call type, from search phase to buzz phase, and know when another bat has found food. So back to local enhancement. In this illustration, we see a bat that's flying over the landscape and that encounters these orange rings, which represent the feeding buzz echolocation calls of another bat. And when this bat hears the other bat's feeding buzz, it knows, again represented by this thought bubble, that that bat has found food, has found a patch of insects, so it can go there for food. And then there's a cooperative version of this strategy as well, and we call this group facilitation. So here you can see that the bats here on the left, first they're leaving their tree roost together, and then as they fly out over the landscape, they're producing search face calls represented by these gray half rings. And then when one finds an insect patch, the others hear this feeding buzz, represented again by the orange rings, and join that bat at the insect patch like we see in this inset here. So this is cooperative, but in a slightly different way. It's because the bats have to coordinate their flight to stay within hearing distance of each other so that they can search collectively, which allows them to search a much larger area as a group than they could alone. So I've told you about these 4 strategies that bats can use to help them find food. But when and where and why would one strategy make more sense or be more beneficial than the other? And you may be wondering, doesn't sharing information about food you found also have some costs? Because this means you have to share that food itself, and there might even be competition between you and others to get enough food at the patch. And the answer to these questions is all about food distribution. So how food is spread out on the landscape. So if you compare these orange dots, which represent food on the left, with the orange dots on the right, you can see that on the left, they're distributed evenly and in small clumps, whereas on the right, they're distributed in much larger clumps, but they're much rarer or less common. And also these clumps on the left are short-lived, meaning that they're only available for a short period of time. So this already distinguishes between the first section of this flowchart. Oops, sorry. That on the left, we have resources that are uniform and long-lasting versus resources on the right that are patchy and short-lived. And these resources on the right are those that are hard to find for animals, and so where it might be really useful to have social information. And in the second part of the flowchart, an important distinction is whether these rarer but larger clumps of food are able to be shared among multiple individuals. If so, this is why competition isn't so costly. If the food is abundant enough to be shared, the benefit of finding it at all is going to be greater than that cost of having to share some of that food. And these ideas about food distribution have actually been known for quite some time. So now in my PhD, I've been developing a framework to extend these ideas and to look at the 4 strategies that I explained to you before to see whether we can predict when one strategy is more beneficial than the other, and what factors might determine this. And this framework applies not just to bats, but a wide range of animals that forage on patchy but short-lived and shareable resources or food sources, which includes animals as varied as scavengers like vultures that look for dead carcasses, to dolphins looking for huge schools of small fish. So this is our framework, and it's divided into 2 dimensions. So one dimension is in green on the top, and the other is in blue on the side, and we'll get to that one in a sec. So the green dimension on the top is the ecological dimension because it relates to the animal's environment. So first we ask, how long does the food that an animal is searching for last in one location? Like humans looking for a good restaurant versus looking for those good daily specials. So if an animal's food lasts for longer time periods, like maybe longer than a day or a night, then information could be shared away from that food source at the roost. So this is what defines the following and recruitment strategies. But if food lasts for shorter time periods, like for much less than one night, maybe even just an hour, information can't be shared about them at the roost because the food won't be available anymore at that same place the next time the animals go out to find food. And this is what defines local enhancement or group facilitation strategies, that information has to be used on the landscape close to the food. And now for the evolutionary dimension. So let's flip that on its side so it's a bit easier to read. But the evolutionary dimension relates to the costs and benefits of these behaviors for the individual's survival and reproduction. So here we ask, how valuable is social information use? Is it higher or is it lower? Because this determines the kind of behavior in the strategy, whether cooperative or opportunistic. And there are several different factors that can make social information more valuable. Maybe it's that the animal is reproductive and either pregnant or lactating, so it needs more energy and thus really needs to find food efficiently. Or maybe the animal is looking for food during a time of year when its food sources are just in general more limited and thus even harder to find. And these conditions might make that value of social information use higher, that without using social information, the animals might not be able to find enough food, or maybe not find it quickly enough, or maybe just not find any food at all. So then these costs of cooperative strategies, like signaling to others that you found food, or having to coordinate your flight to fly with others, would be outweighed by these essential benefits. So together, the ecological and evolutionary dimensions make up our framework for predicting these strategies of social information use for animals that forage for food that's unpredictable but shareable. But as scientists, naturally, we are not satisfied with simply putting ideas together. As logical as they may seem, we have to test them. So our first step to test this framework, to see if it fits what we actually see animals doing in nature, was to review the literature or the studies already done on social foraging in bats, like when bats are social while looking for food. And in particular, studies that track bats in some way. And tracking bats has been difficult for a really long time because they're so small, and you always just have to be really careful with how much weight you give animals to carry, especially flying animals like birds and bats. So there aren't crazy numbers of studies already done on social foraging in bats, but we were able to identify these species I show here as those that have been studied thoroughly enough that we can answer all 4 questions of the framework, which already gives some indication that we've included the right factors in our framework. But actually, there are several more species for which we can answer some of the questions, but not all. So here, our framework identifies the gaps or the missing information that we need to be able to understand how certain bat species use social information. And also importantly, to continue just to test these ideas of how the distribution of food at a fine scale can help us predict how animals use social information. And this is actually the second part of my PhD, applying this framework to test the social information use strategy of a bat species in Panama. Actually, this little species right here. So with the time I have left, I'm going to tell you about the methods we use to collect data in Panama and how we can use this data to test the questions from our framework. So I work with some very special bats called lesser bulldog bats, or Noctilio albiventris, that forage in a particularly beautiful place. Here they're foraging at dusk, right as the sun is setting, looking for swarming insects over the Chagres River, this river here. And we actually took this video from kayaks, like you can see it in this lower picture, while we were tracking them. So you can see several bats flying together, which is what we commonly observe. And this is already suggesting that they're doing something social as they look for food. So I do all this field work in Gamboa, Panama, which is also a very special place. It's located right next to the Panama Canal, where this big river called the Chagres joins the canal and also on the edge of a huge national park. So there's a lot of words here, but yeah, as scientists, we always start with the questions and hypotheses. So according to our framework, we have 4 questions to ask. And this is what we hypothesize for each of them. So how long does the food last? That patches of insects are only available for short periods of time and not in the same locations night after night. And then where is social information used? That Noctilia albiventris use social information close to insect patches. Then how valuable is social information use? That social information use is more valuable for Noctilia albiventris in the climatic season when food is harder to find. And finally, what kind of behavior do they exhibit? That Noctilia albiventris uses a cooperative strategy in the season when food is harder to find, and an opportunistic strategy in the season when food is easier to find. So to measure how long food lasts, I place camera traps on the Chagres River where the bats search for food. And these camera traps take pictures with flash at set intervals. And in the pictures, we can see insects as white dots. And with this, we can measure when and where insects are available in the places where the bats forage. And we track whole colonies of these bats with GPS loggers to know when and for how long they search for food. And importantly, where they search for food relative to their other group members. So as you can imagine, it's very simple for me to tell you like that this is what we do. But another thing entirely to actually make this data collection happen. So one thing I can already look back on and laugh at is how at first, for some reason, I thought that these floating platforms for the cameras that we wanted to anchor in the water could be anchored with like teeny tiny fishing weights, the one that Marian here is holding in her hand. We quickly upgraded to large stones and eventually realized we needed to use these huge cinder blocks, filling up this entire back of our truck. And yeah, this resulted in things like borrowing gigantic canoes to transport all the cinder blocks on the water, and then also some somewhat precarious trips in small kayaks, also loaded down with many cinder blocks. And there actually caiman, which are like small crocodiles in this water. So I had some very brave field assistants joining me. And then it wouldn't be field work in the tropics if you didn't have to carry on despite sudden torrential downpours. So here we are collecting cameras from platforms in the rain. And then actually way more challenging than the data collection for the prey landscape is capturing and recapturing the bats to give them GPS loggers. The bats that I study, Noctilia albiventris, are pretty adaptable when it comes to where they roost. So we have some colonies living in old houses or buildings, and then some living in natural tree roosts. And so to ensure that we captured all the individuals for all the colonies, we had to come up with some pretty crazy trapping methods. This one I'm particularly proud of, even if it looks ridiculous. So here you can see, yeah, this is where the bats fly out and they hit and bounce off of this net here that you actually probably can't see, and then are just funneled down into this, this chute. And yeah, as you can see in this picture, it actually worked. So here we caught a lot of bats. Yeah, so now I'll share some of the data that we actually collected with these methods and how we'll analyze it to answer the questions of our framework. So for the first question, how long does food last? We use data from our camera traps, and an example of that data is shown here. So on the horizontal axis, we have the time of night from sunset to midnight. And then each of these colored lines goes up and down according to the number of insects detected in photos every 5 minutes. And each color, A or B or pink and blue, represents a different location over the water. And this is just a tiny, tiny subset of the data we have. But yeah, you also have 2 different dates represented here. So maybe you can already see that the amount of insects present is first mostly concentrated, like at the beginning of each evening, but the amount of insects is not consistent from night to night in the same location, which tells us that these insect patches only last for a very short period of time and not enough time for Noctilio to bring that information back to the roost. So next, we work with our GPS data. And so here you can see the track of just one individual. And the first step to analyze this data is to divide this track into two different behaviors the bat could be showing, either searching the landscape or actually feeding in a patch. And maybe you can see this for yourself, but when the bat seems to stay in one small area for a longer time, this is when we know that it's feeding. And so we can use methods of segmentation to divide the track into these two behaviors. So this plot just shows the GPS points in space, and the red represents feeding, and blue is searching or commuting from the roost to the foraging area. And determining when these two behaviors occur helps us answer the second question of the framework: where is social information used? So we have tracks of many individuals foraging all at the same time. So we can look to see whether the direction or the trajectory of an individual that's searching changes when it gets within a certain distance of a feeding individual who's likely producing those feeding buzz echolocation calls. And because we already understand actually a lot about the echolocation behavior, especially in this species, we can calculate the distance that it should be able to hear another individual. And if one of our tracked bats changes its trajectory at this distance, it suggests it's using social information to locate a patch of insects. So something like this. You'll see this blue bat jump over to join this green bat at a patch. And then next, to test how valuable social information use is, we have done all this data collection in two different seasons. So the sunny, dry season and the rainy, wet season. And these plots you see show how many insects were detected over all the nights that we collected data in the dry, sunny season versus the wet, rainy season. And here you can already see from the plot on the top that many more insects were available in the dry season compared to the wet season. So maybe insects are much harder to find in the wet season. And so next, we can compare the GPS tracks of the bats from these two different seasons to see what kind of behavior they were exhibiting, whether it was opportunistic or cooperative. So testing this, whether they're using social information in an opportunistic or cooperative way, we will use the GPS tracks of all the bats tracked at the same time and do something called social network analysis. So you can think about this kind of like the social networks we form with our friends in person or online, like Facebook, where the more time that we spend or the more interactions we have with those friends, the stronger our connection is. So this is represented by this funny figure you see. So the dots represent people or bats, and the lines represent that connection between them. And the thicker the line, the more time they spend together or the more interactions that they have. And we want to see if this is true for our bats. Do they have kind of like friends that they like to forage near and share information with, rather than just eavesdropping opportunistically on other individuals? Because this would suggest that they're employing a more cooperative strategy. And then we can test if they only do this when insects are less plentiful in the wet season, when they're harder to find, because maybe this is when bats really have to rely on their friends to find enough food. So it might look like this, like where these bats seem to be moving from one patch to another together. And we've already made observations of this in the field, like in this, oops, let's play this. Like in this video, you see where noctilia are kind of seem to be bouncing over the water, foraging, but with several other individuals. And these were taken with these special night vision binoculars we have. So yeah, these are the 4 questions from our framework that we're trying to answer with the data we've been collecting. And so hopefully in the next time I get to talk with you all, I'll be able to tell you the answers to all these questions. That we're asking with the data of Noctilia albiventris in Panama. So yeah, now though we've already arrived at the end of the talk, but I hope that you all come away with at least these 2 conclusions. That one, that bats have some really cool ways of using social information to find food, and that this is important for us to know and understand, because just like a bat's habitat and food are important for its conservation, access to other individuals and the social information that they provide may also be crucial for bat conservation. And then 2, that you yourself are probably using social information much more than you think, and maybe in some similar ways to bats. So just maybe studying bats helps us better understand ourselves. And yeah, with that, I want to thank you all for being here and for listening to this talk. Have many people to thank. First, Jenna Kohles, my supervisor, and my PhD, who supports me in countless ways. Then my lab members, both here in Germany and with the Bat Lab in Gamboa, Panama, who also provide so much support. And then last but not least, these 3 crazy, amazing women who helped me collect this data in Panama over 3 field seasons. And then of course, these sources of funding, these great institutes. And yeah, with that, I would be super happy to take any questions.
Hello, Jenna, I'm back. Thank you very much for your talk. We already have some questions. Feel free to type them in. I will ask them to Jenna directly. So the first question in the chat is there any pollution noticeable from the Panama Canal on your research site?
That's a good question. So for sure there is, yeah, stuff that flows down the river, trash and other debris. And yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of boats that are ships going through that canal every day. I only study these bats in Gamboa, so I can't actually make a comparison to like a location where maybe the habitat is more pristine. Thankfully, we are right on this edge of this huge protected forest. So yeah, and the population numbers look good. So it seems like there's enough for these bats to survive and keep their populations up in this location. But it's definitely makes us wonder sometimes what the effects of the canal might be compared to species and compared to Noctilio and other parts of the world. Okay.
I hope this was the answer. Let's see, otherwise just type it in again.
Yeah,
in the beginning, you said there are 1,400 bat species. Who counted them? How can you find out how many species there are?
Yeah, it's amazing, right? So actually, I don't even know, it's over 1,400 species. That number is continuing to grow because we're finding with genetic data that there are a lot of cryptic species. So species that like have huge ranges that we've always assumed were one species, but actually, if you look at their genetic, if you look at their genes, like you can actually see that these are different species. So there are people, and amazing labs that are actually, doing this work to really document all this diversity we see in bats. But yeah, the cool thing is that the number continues to grow.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
And then we have a comment on, I think it was the catching method. That looks pretty ingenious. Good way to avoid hurting them with catching them in full flight.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, cool. I'm glad. Yeah, exactly. We like to think that it was maybe a bit fun for them to slide down that chute.
That's very cool. And then we have a thank you. Thank you very much for the great presentation. It was a great introduction into the topic. And could you also do these studies on bats in Germany?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that Dina's lab, like we have plans to do this. We would love to do this here in Germany as well. There's been talk of maybe doing with Nyctilus noctula, which is the common noctule that another lab member studies. And yeah, using the same kind of methods. We actually are already monitoring the prey landscape or this insect distribution here in Constance. Actually, we're doing field work tonight. There's already a couple of my lab members that are setting up cameras on platforms right now. So that part has already been started, and then we would, love to GPS track bats here in Germany, at like whole groups of them to address these same kind of questions. And something we're also trying to do in the future, both in Panama, but then also potentially here in Germany. There's some other technology called proximity sensors that they're tags that we put on the bats, and they communicate with each other, and they record when two bats come into close contact with each other. So like you can imagine with that social network analysis that I plan to do with my GPS tracks, these proximity sensors like collect data that would directly feed into that kind of analysis. And the cool thing is that data transmits wirelessly, so you don't have to get those loggers back. That's actually something that was a huge challenge in my field season so far, is that the bats are just really smart. They're very, like, once you catch them, they hear you setting up that trap or these nets, and they don't want to come out of their roosts. So sometimes we can't get all the data, or we can't get all the loggers back to get all that data. So yeah, we can then use these proximity sensors, which would just fall off the bats, but transmit the data to us wirelessly. And then, yeah, further test these questions about where social information use is happening, and is it in an opportunistic way or a more cooperative way. But yeah.
So a lot of possibilities and
yes.
challenges.
Exactly. Yeah, research will continue. Exactly.
That's pretty cool. So please type in more questions. I have another one, because I love to know how you as a scientist live wherever you study your animals. So how is it to be in Panama? How do you live there? What is it like? I mean, yeah, I have no idea.
It's incredible. I mean, so yeah, I've now been going to Panama for fieldwork since 2014. And yeah, so clearly it's a great life down there when we're in the field. So it's a very funny place, because Gamboa, it actually used to be a US military base. And then when the US kind of gave over control of the canal back to the Panamanians, and a lot of them left and went back to the States, it was a bit abandoned. And so, but then like Panamanians moved in there, and other, like the STRI kind of started doing research there. And yeah, so it's this kind of like little village. There's like no shops there whatsoever. We have to drive into Panama City like about 45 minutes or up to 2 hours if there's traffic, to just get groceries and things. But yeah, we live in like these apartments, these like funky looking buildings that are really old, and a lot of them have a lot of termite damage, but like still it's kind of nice, because at the end of every day, I can like take a shower in this apartment, and we have Wi-Fi. We have this beautiful new Institute building in Gamboa. So we have really nice lab facilities. So it's just a really cool place that like you're on the edge of this beautiful landscape, this really natural, pristine area, into this national park I was talking about, and the Chagres River as well. Even though, of course, yeah, like we were talking about a bit ago, there is some pollution or like some influence of the Panama Canal activity. But yeah, you live in this beautiful place, but you kind of also have access to resources that make it really a lot easier to do research. So for like instance, when I was talking about, we needed to buy all these cinder blocks because, I don't know, I had this terrible idea that we could anchor platforms in a moving river with tiny weights. We could just go into Panama City. I mean, it's still like a day trip when we need to go into Panama City, but we could just drive into the city and get those supplies. And so it's not like one of these crazy remote field sites where, you know, you hike or like take small planes and then you're out there and have no contact to the outside world for months. We're a little bit more in this halfway state.
That's cool.
Which is really cool. Yeah.
Yeah. We know it from other researchers at our institute, which had this troubles on islands with no infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, it must be.
Yeah, this must be just crazy. I've experienced this once. So I think I mentioned at the beginning, I went to Peru for kind of like my first field experience in the tropics. And we were like 24 hours by boat down the Amazon River and like had no contact with anyone for a month. And I mean, it's also amazing. That is something really, really cool. I think now at this stage of my life, I'm happy to also kind of have this in between and still get to be with these incredible bat species and like be in the field and but maybe not deal with all the logistics of being so remote.
That's cool. So one more question arrived. How does the rain affect the flight of the bats?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so in general, bats, if it's raining really hard at that time when bats are supposed to go out to forage, they won't go out to forage. So for sure, it seems like there's some impact on their flight. Like they could still fly in light rain, but in general, they don't really do it. And we think a lot of it also has to do with thermoregulation. So if the bat gets wet, it gets cold really quickly, and this can be really dangerous for it. So there's been some studies showing that even like the sound, if there were some people in Gamboa that played back the sound of rain near the entrances to bat roosts, and just the sound alone kept bats from coming out to forage, even to like look for food, even if it wasn't actually raining. So they definitely avoid this time when it's raining. But there's also, yeah, bats have really high metabolisms, and they can't often go for many nights, if even one night, without eating, because they just, yeah, they don't have a lot of fat stores and their flight is really expensive. So yeah, if they have to skip a night because it's raining, they might the next night, even if it's raining a little bit, they might risk it to try to get some food. And actually for my species, this is really important because so kind of like I was showing with the insects, that like they're really only available for this peak after sunset, which probably sounds, you know, familiar to a lot of you. I mean, we all know if we're out in the garden or like by the lake, there's that like 40-minute period where the mosquitoes start to come out and then they kind of go away. And this is really similar to what the insects are doing in Panama. So if rain occurs and keeps the bats from going out to forage, if they leave after the rain stops, there actually might not be any food for them available. So it's this tricky trade-off. But for sure it affects the bats, and yeah, this is more difficult for them in the wet season. Thankfully, like the rains often are concentrated in the afternoon rather than the evening. So I think this is good for the bats.
Then they at least have a chance to find some food. Very cool.
Exactly.
I think that were some very nice words in the end. Everyone finds some food. It's dinner time, so thank you so much for being here, Jenna.
Yeah, thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, it was.
And for all of you out there, thank you as well. This was our last talk for this pre-summer season. Now we have a summer break, and then it goes on September 14th with a German talk again. It's called Freundschaften und das Miteinander bei Affen mit Urs Kalbitzer. So this will be also very, very another topic, let's say just another topic and other animals and somewhere on the world. So just travel with MaxCine when you can travel otherwise. Well, then I wish you a very nice evening, and another thank you for the presentation. Keep up the good work, as it says in the live chat. That's what I want to say as well. Thank you very much, Jenna. Thank you very much out there. Have a good evening.
Well, bye, everyone. Thank you.